As the servers bring out your dessert and coffee and stuff, we'd like to go ahead and get this part of the meeting going, and we're going to try to do this as efficiently as possible, with the intention of being out of here by 9. Okay. It's a little bit before 8 o'clock, and I think we'll be fine. An announcement. I'd like to just an announcement to the sponsors. Announcement to the sponsors. If those of you who are with industry, and those of you who are on the planning or the meeting committee, if you could stay briefly after the meeting, just to give us some feedback. We did this last time a couple of years ago, and it helped enormously. So we would like to hear from you. What went well for you? What went poorly? Hopefully, nothing went poorly. But anyway, we do want you to stay, and if you feel that way, and give us some feedback. Okay. Before we get into the reports, I am going to ask Louisa Ostrowski-Zeichner to come up and announce the winners of the posters. So I hope the fellows are still here. Come on.
So we managed to sneak something by Pete, and the board met, and we decided that to honor our first president of MSG-ERC, we are going to name, we're going to establish the Young Investigator Award in the name of Peter G. Pappas. So we are going to, we're going to do some awards. We did 3 awards. I'm going to start by giving out the third place. And the third place goes to Florian Corneli for his study on attributable mortality of Candidemia after introduction of echinocandins. Come on up. Thank you very much. Thank you. Got it? Our second place is going to go to, I hope I'm not going to butcher your name. My name has been butchered all my life, so I should know better, but Shiwei Zhu, for comparison between endpoint and real-time PCR reaction for diagnosis of pneumocystis pneumonia. And the first place, who's going to be designated as the Peter G. Pappas Young Investigator Awardee for 2018, is also awarded a monetary award of $500. Again, a big incentive for young investigators to come to this meeting and present posters and interact with us. And the first place goes to Masa Abbasi, with her study of CSF lactate as a marker of disease severity. Masa is a 2018 Peter G. Pappas Young Investigator. Here's your award, and here's your check.
Thank you.
All righty. Congratulations to the young investigators. Note that 2 out of the 3 were young or women. How nice. Another round of applause for these guys. Yeah, girl power, okay. The next part of this really is the next 30 minutes or so is the results of the working, the works of these working sessions. And so in sequence, each of the leaders of these discussions has put together a slide, just a set of slides to go over the conclusions. We're not going to come to any conclusions relative to the projects that are going to be ultimately endorsed, et cetera, but this really gives us a foundation. And we basically take the results of those comments and assimilate them into some basic projects, kind of a to-do list, if you will. And then when we get home, we pare it down to something that is actually feasible, can be done in the next couple of years. So I'm going to ask Luis to come up and share the candidate group's summary, and then we'll go to crypto after that.
Can we have the first PowerPoint, please? Perfect, thank you. So we started off the candidate session by discussing the ongoing and upcoming clinical trials. We discussed the Cidara 101 study, Amplex 001, Synexus 08. And again, all of these studies are open for enrollment, and this is the right time to be approaching sponsors if you want your site to be still considered for one of the studies. We discussed the opportunity of a phase 3 trial with Synexus with Abraxa versus standard of care. This study is going to be hopefully receiving the input of MSG-ERC, and we're going to be participating in the analysis and the DRC as well. And we discussed the Toyama drug as well as an opportunity for us to collaborate as a CRO or perhaps with NIH. So again, these are the clinical trials that are in the launching pad or ongoing, and a good opportunity for us to jump in. Then our discussion turned into the challenges to enrollment into clinical trials. We really discussed the need for more international sites. We all know that the US is currently one of the slowest enrollers in big international trials. We discussed India, Central and South America, and Chandra really offered up the possibility of working with the India ID Society to try to find more sites. We discussed how we're having really poor screen to enrollment ratios in our candidate studies, and the reasons that were given were too much prior therapy that would make you ineligible for the study, absence of clinical signs for candidemia as a possible key to open it to more patients, patients that are too sick, organ failure, exclusion labs like LFTs, GFR, concomitant meds for phase 2 trials become a big problem. And we actually also discussed the hampering of the studies with microbiological data and the need to go into markers and try to approach this in a culture-negative setting. We also discussed the definitions of disease. We don't have real official definitions of proven and probable candidiasis, and we do need to tap into the markers as the key to enrolling clinical trials, and perhaps to use them as an endpoint in the studies as well. This resulted in the proposed solutions for those problems. We discussed developing a white paper to address these difficulties in enrolling patients in clinical trials, submit to FDA, a journal, and really talk about what's hampering enrollment of these patients. We discussed talking to more international sites, talking to our CROs and sponsors, and trying to open the door for this types of sites. And we discussed the use of non-culture-based markers for, again, enrollment and endpoint adjudication. A big area of discussion was what happens to candidemia patients who are approached but not enrolled in studies. Again, with the screen failure rates that we're having, this is the majority of candidemia patients that are happening in the world at this point. And we really thought that it would be very interesting to have some sort of a registry of invasive candidiasis coupled with clinical trials where you were collecting patients that had candidemia and they either go into a clinical trial or they go into the registry, and that would allow us to look at things like what happens to people that fail, like we're going to be doing with the Nature MSG16 study, what happens with rare organisms, MDR, diagnostics, approaches, outcomes. So we think this is going to be very interesting. Of course, this is going to have to be funded by multiple sponsors, knowing that they will all have access to this data, and we're going to have to work out the logistics for such a registry. Diagnostics, we discussed at length that we still have a lot to learn about the performance characteristics of non-culture-based diagnostic assays. And we also discussed the need to provide some guidance to the community as to diagnostic algorithms on how to utilize all these diagnostic methods that we've been starting to get in the past decade or so. We had a brief discussion about microbiome research, and we really wanted to tag along some microbiome research to the current clinical trials or future clinical trials, where we would be consenting people to obtain stool samples or oral samples, following markers for inflammation, using this as an endpoint for example, colonization. So again, this is something that was brought forward as a kind of a future state and something we're willing to invest our time on. Epidemiology, we had some sort of doubts about the incidence data that was presented, about 23,000 cases in the US. We think there's more. CDC went through the rationale for obtaining this number. We really discussed how Candida auris is going to be our main vessel to get some traction in surveillance for fungal disease, and getting to talk to some regulators about fungal infections. And we needed to also study the impact of infection control programs systematically, which is something that hasn't been really done. So again, CDC is going to have a surveillance system for Candida auris, and the question for us at MSG is how can we tag along with this? What can we contribute to the CDC, and how we can synergize in surveillance for these infections? Again, we spend a lot of time with Candida auris, and we do think that we could create a network that would capture cases as it starts to spread more through the United States and other international sites, and do a more in-depth description of the epidemiology, diagnosis, what happens really with the environment in multiple hospital settings, and what people are doing to treat these patients and what the outcomes are. And again, we do think that this is an opportunity to collaborate with the CDC. Perhaps we need to all sit down and develop, again, some sort of a registry based in REDCaps, which is something we're all using nowadays. And this was a large area of discussion for our group. Finally, we started to talk about host susceptibility. We do need to validate existing data in ICU patients. How can we approach this? We did discuss the impact of all these new biologic agents that are coming out and the lack of systematically obtained data for the risk of not only Candida but other fungal infections. So again, we sort of floated the idea around of developing a registry. Another idea that floated around was to sort of create a position paper or a guideline with recommendations to really addressing the risk of these infections in biologic receiving patients, and how to prophylax or look for or screen. And we feel that this is an area where there's a lot of need, and MSG can feature its sort of brain power very, very prominently. And finally, we discussed future state again, host genetics, and how could we sort of create a rapid genetic screening mechanism to identify patients at risk that would truly benefit from prophylaxis or preemptive therapy when they're in the ICU setting, in the ward, in the oncology ward, et cetera. We discussed the creation of a biobank. We discussed all the difficulties that Dr. Perfect and Wingard have gone through with the Aztec study. But again, we think that we could do something like this. We discussed the idea of developing consent templates that can be plugged into current studies or future studies as well. Controls, thousands of patients, how could we address this? PK genomics, and again, the big obstacle here is who's going to fund this. This is a project that would really need federal funding or foundation funding to try to address this lack of information. And we have a Mexican and Greek fusion here. Gracias and Evharisto.
Very good, Luis. You almost got the Evharisto just about right. That's terrific. You can see the Canada plate is real full, and we're going to have to pare this down. Personally, I think given the amount of time we spend on talking about host susceptibility, et cetera, I really think we need to explore and push that and just really drive it to the extent that we can. All right, we need the crypto group will be next, and so is it going to be John or David? Okay. Okay, that's fine. Come on up. A tandem. All right, great. So David Boulware, John Perfect will be discussing the summary of the crypto discussion.
I think we might have slide envy. Our slides are much shorter and briefer, but so just to kind of summarize what are the challenges and what are the sort of the current call to arms. And so, do you want to be challenging?
No, go ahead.
All right. So basically, kind of the themes that came out, in the discussion as well as conversations with other folks that. We know a fair amount about the organism, but really, the challenge is really the host phenotype. That most of the data from cryptococcal meningitis is really based on HIV population from the pre-ART era, and so people that are not on HIV therapy with HIV, and so the non-HIV, non-transplant population really don't know much about it at all. Transplant populations, really, what is the optimal care is sort of limited. And even the HIV populations in the ART era with HIV therapy, how best to manage antiretrovirals is sort of unknown. The naming, basically?
Yeah, so the taxonomy, again, I think what we need to do is sit down with some of the taxonomists, maybe ISHAM, come up with a little committee to actually look at crypto. We've got enough genetic data right now. We just need to sit down and get a group together to actually get naming that will actually be available for the next 20 or 30 years and stuff like that. There's a lot of problem with the naming of the organisms, particularly just in publishing and trying to identify which one we're talking about. So I think we're getting to a stage where, as John Taylor talked about it, we've got to bring all the players to the table. If we bring all the players to the table, I think there would be less confusion. So that's a goal that I think we need to go after.
So then the next item, which we'll come back to later, is sort of a package of care for patients. And so patients are very heterogeneous, and sort of the role of supportive care for crypto meningitis. And so while we always sort of say crypto meningitis, really it's a meningoencephalitis, that there's crypto in the brain. And so not forgetting about that. And so I'll come back to that later. Sort of other challenges are the access to antifungals, and so there's really sort of a need for advocacy, and so there is a advanced disease consortium that CDC and others, it's sort of a partnership with Unitaid and CDC and MSF and some academic folks trying to really sort of advocate for access to medications. And so even things like fluconazole, so the diflucan partnership program is sort of dying a slow death. And so fluconazole is not readily available in low-income countries. Amphotericin is available in middle-income countries, but not commonly in low-income countries outside of sort of tertiary referral centers in the capital city. Flucytosine is not registered and not available, but sort of making progress potentially on that. But we have sort of the guidelines of using amphotericin and flucytosine, but that's really not available in most low and middle-income countries. And so people opt for suboptimal therapy. And then the last sort of current challenge is the asymptomatic CRAG population of sort of it's in WHO guidelines for screening, but actually implementing that, and then what is the optimal therapy. And so call to action. Who wants to call?
Okay, so again, we have multiple different possibilities. There's at least 3 or 4 drugs that could actually potentially be available. I think we as MSG need to help with the proposals on these things, help with identification of the sites, and I think there is the opportunity now, particularly with the vouchers and various things, to actually get clinical trials done on anti-cryptococcal drugs, as was described. There's at least 3 or 4 of these drugs, and including even some creative stuff like neurophoresis, where we can actually dialyze the CSF. All these, I think, are for us to help out their novel type of therapies. They're small populations. We know about these things. We have people within the MSG that can help out on it. And so it's a fairly exciting time to be able to be available to these people that actually have these drugs that are coming down the pike.
So another sort of low-hanging fruit, sort of in need of improvement, is really the preemptive therapy for the asymptomatic CRAG population to prevent overt meningitis. And so at present, this is fluconazole monotherapy, and clearly the people with higher cryptococcal titers in blood have worse outcomes. And so whether that's sort of enhanced therapy for all or sort of a precision medicine customized therapy is sort of yet to be determined, but certainly we can improve upon a 25% mortality rate, which is basically the same mortality rate as Ebola in the NIH Ebola trials. And so you take an asymptomatic person, you should be able to keep them alive. So I think we can do better on that.
One of the areas that we need to try to tackle in some way, shape, or form, probably the biggest problem I have when people call and try to interact or they email and stuff like that is the issue around iris and the management of iris and the identification of iris and the therapies and how long. And so the question of management of, as he talked about, paradoxical iris is a big, big issue. And I think we need to some way bring people together. Surely Peter Williamson's done a lot of work on this thing. And I think it comes a time when you've just got to come up with some strategies that you can throw out there and have some consistency in behavior. It is a big, big issue in the management of those patients on the outside, and it's an extraordinarily hard time for the physicians having to take care of these patients with no backup and having to give something like steroids, which is like gasoline on a fire, but actually you actually need to do that in these type of patients. David talk about the unmasking.
Yeah, similarly, the move, throughout the world of sort of the rapid HIV initiation, the test and treat, where people with subclinical cryptococcal disease that would be detectable by cryptococcal antigen screening are getting put on HIV therapy. And in our experience, they have terrible outcomes. And so they basically have twofold, higher mortality than your ART naive populations. And so this issue of unmasking iris, where there's more of an immune driven sort of putting gasoline on the fire, literally, is not very helpful. And so Josh Ryan, who's in the audience, is sort of looking at that as part of his K award, but certainly sort of management issues, what you do with HIV therapy, do you do immunomodulatory therapy, et cetera. And then I think a lot of the data really over the last decade has come from Africa, some from Southeast Asia, and so there's really a need for U.S. data. And so I think John Badley at UAB, they've got sort of, they think they have data for about 2,000 patients, and so from the U.S. And so looking at what actually happens in routine care in the U.S. and what are the outcomes with its sort of general adherence to the IDSA guidelines versus deviation from the guidelines. And so looking at some of those diverse patient populations where we're unlikely ever to have a clinical trial in transplant populations, but we can look and see what the observational outcomes are with the therapies given and just with observational epi and large sample sizes, hopefully gleaned data to help inform guidelines of what is associated with good and bad outcomes.
Yeah, I agree. This is an interesting issue of trying to use these large biorepositories and try to answer questions that may already be out there. We just need to find the number of patients. And John very elegantly, when we challenged yesterday to see if we could get big not biorepositories, but data from patients within the U.S., was able to quickly come up with 2,000 patients. So I think we need to and continue to explore and mine this thing with either bioinformatics people, try to get this stuff into MSG and have people explore it. I think it's a way to actually understand what's going on, particularly in the United States.
So for those interested, I would say John's going to be the point person on this. I don't know if he knows this, but I think he's already volunteered. So yes, so if you're interested in, I think there's lots of good questions that can be asked with that data set, hopefully. And there'll probably be another 2,000 patients next year. And so this is something that could certainly grow. Another thing that was brought up during the conversation really was the issue of sort of registry and biorepository, and really creating a very enhanced registry that's linked with specimens. So not only the fungus, but also human specimens, so DNA, RNA collections, blood, CSF specimens, so you can actually potentially do future pathogenesis studies and genomic studies with a registry that has patient outcome data. And so that's something that is of interest, and so I think it's always of interest for every sort of disease possibility. The catch is trying to find some funding for that and or someone that wants to write a grant.
Yeah, it's always tricky business, but we're starting to expand our numbers of isolates and patients, and we're starting to store this material. But the problem with this is we're always limited in time and stuff like that. And as the Aztec thing showed you, all of a sudden it's gone. There's no money left, and those freezers are still expensive to actually keep going. So I think we need to talk to Tom Chiller. We'll continue to do this thing to look at the idea of transferring many of our isolates and some of the information and possibly patient specimens to their database or to their biorepository. This might be an opportunity for us to use that and with no cost to us or no cost to the community, and be something that can stay there for a period of time instead of getting stuck when a grant runs out and where do the isolates go. It's important that we actually try to figure this out and start doing this.
There is general consensus that the 2010 guidelines should be updated and more than once a decade, and so that basically need to continually update that, and the question of how to do that. And is IDSA the right group, or should MSG have our own guidelines that we can sort of endorse and be more of a living document that is updated more frequently as the field emerges? So that was a general topic.
Yeah, I agree, David. One of the things we have to eventually decide, does MSG ever want to be in the guideline business or not? It's a tricky business to know whether you want to do that or not. But we have a lot of expertise here, and it can actually probably go a lot more rapid than some of the other standard society guidelines. And so I put it up there, and that the IDSA guidelines are suffering along. I'm not sure exactly when they'll actually be updated. But we should also continue to challenge ourselves whether we actually want to be in that business or not. Oh, and Dave was giving me on that because we're going to talk about the taxonomy thing. I mentioned that I think it comes to a point where we need to get people together in a room or at a meeting or someplace to talk about the taxonomy and bring the major players into that to see if we can come up with a strategy and a white paper to kind of settle this, hopefully for 50 years or so.
So, and the last sort of thing on the list we didn't really talk about here at the meeting, but it's not something that's really been of interest to our group, sort of doing clinical research, and that's really sort of what's the package of supportive care to treat the patient. And so for the physicians in the room, you're familiar with sort of the sepsis bundle, sort of this bundle of care. And so for meningitis patients, should we have a bundle of care that is implementable? And so some of this may be more targeted towards low-income country settings, but community hospitals and outside of academic, high-volume medical centers that sort of reminding people of what is the sort of a bundle of care to implement for the high-risk patients. And so to kind of just give a couple hints on this. So Masa Basi is really quite interested in this, of looking at patients with altered mental status. And just a couple slides here from our prior just experience in Uganda over the last sort of decade and a half. using amphotericin-based therapy, we were able to basically improve the survival from under 50% at 30 days up to almost 80% at 30 days. And so it's with the same exact drug, and so it's amphotericin-based therapy. But it was sort of a package of care that we were able to implement. Things like IV fluids, which, okay, yes, you sort of take for granted in the US, but IV fluids, potassium supplementation, monitoring potassium and creatinine. And so sort of very basic implementing sort of a bundle of care that basically this got into WHO guidelines. And so thinking about higher risk patients that we know, the patients that come in comatose and with altered mental status or with seizures. And so looking at sort of the overall bundle of care. And so another sort of aspect of this is anemia. And so in the US, not a lot of our patients are anemic, but in Africa it's very common. And so anemia is a really strong risk factor for mortality. And so if you're basically, have a low hemoglobin, less than 8.5, your mortality is almost twofold higher than if you're not anemic. And so there's actually a mechanism for this that we've I think we at least have a hypothesis for. And so another paper we published this year was looking at cerebral oximetry. And so in the ORs and things like that, the anesthesiologists, stick on these probes on the scalp and can basically measure tissue oxygenation in the brain. And so basically what we found, not surprising, is if you don't perfuse your brain and have low oxygen levels in your brain, it's associated with high mortality. And so the strongest predictor of that was your hemoglobin level, and so basically your oxygen carrying capacity. And so, thinking about non-invasive monitoring strategies and how to sort of implement a bundle of care to potentially improve outcomes, not only for survival, but also neurologic deficits and things like that. That sort of aspect, it's not as sexy and sort of novel as a new antifungal drug, but that the antifungal aspect is one thing, but also sort of how to take care of the patient is another. So I've sort of just put that out for the future as something to think about. Okay, and that was our crypto moment.
One of the best things about this meeting, in my view, in fact, the distinguishing feature of this meeting is just this laying the agenda and going through the real needs. I should remind everyone, I say that to remind myself, that we are going to create a white paper of the proceedings, the recommendations, the opportunities that we've identified in these 4 areas. So those of us who are on these, the facilitators need to get pen to paper soon, because we don't want these to get cold. Marissa Michelli is going to, that's really how you pronounce it, correct? No. Oh, come on. No.
No, but at this stage, everybody pronounces,
Okay.
it's acceptable, right. So no worries.
Marissa is going to go over Aspergillus and other mold.
Okay. Okay. Well, first I want to thank Katie Linder for volunteering to take notes during the whole debate. So that was very nice of her. So we focus on the areas of discussion. Basically, we can summarize in 5 areas. The clinical trial design, unmet needs, the gaps in knowledge, the breakthrough IFIs as a new problem, the resistance and the problem with the break points, and the antifungal prophylaxis in lung transplant recipients. So starting with the clinical trial designs, we identified that the main pitfalls that lead to poor enrollment are the poor defined endpoints mainly, the unrealistic inclusion and exclusion criteria, and the widespread use of prophylaxis. So then we discussed how we could improve these problems, and one of the questions was towards that solution is, should we start thinking outside the box? Should we be using more inclusive criteria to include these patients and not limit ourselves to BMT or AML population? So should we include also patients that, despite being on other experimental drugs, should we redefine the use of biomarkers not only as a diagnostic tools, but also as a outcome endpoints? And should we also change our endpoints, and should we consider softer endpoints at this time? Another question that came up was, should we be working internationally? That would enable us to accept patients that are prophylaxis naive. Also, we would be able to include patients that had a broader spectrum of the same infection. And then how will we do this? So one of the ideas that was brought up was, should we develop a global network for clinical trials? What would be the role for MSG on this, and how we would be more inclusive for international centers? So then we identified also that there were gaps in knowledge. And one of the main questions was, do we really understand the novel chemotherapy agents and how they impact on the risk for the fungal infections in our patients? And should we offer prophylaxis to those patients or not? And we also need to determine the epidemiology. I mean, how big of a problem is it? And understanding those areas would also help us to develop a strategy to risk stratification of those patients. So then the problem of breakthrough infections was brought up as well, and this is a major problem that we all are seeing, and we also recognize that it's not just the emergency of Aspergillus fumigatus resistance to azole, it's also the emergency of other pathogens that are intrinsically resistant to these drugs as well. And also was brought up, and we are thinking that probably it's not just the emergency of resistance itself, it's more of a reflection of how severe immunosuppressed these patients are, and it's not necessarily an antifungal failure, how we need to see these patients. And also, we agreed that there is no consensus definition for breakthrough infections at this time. So how can we improve that? And one of the ways is to construct a uniform definition for breakthrough infections to characterize these patients that develop breakthrough infections as well. So how we would envision clinical trials for these breakthrough infections. I mean, this, and it was discussed that probably an ideal trial should include amphotericin B versus a new agent or experimental agent. And so the other idea was to aim for more comprehensive design to achieve multiple goals during the same study. Then, for example, to include goals as testing for resistance, testing for outcomes, identifying risk factors, genetic testing, etc. So the matter of breakpoints was also brought up. There is more data needed and needs to be for the breakpoints in mold. Does the MSG have a role on pursuing this? And also, we need a more solid pathogen identification methods. And again, what is the role of MSG on all this? Then finally, the problem of lung transplantation and antifungal therapy was brought up, and the need for address that this practice is not an FDA-approved application of these medications, and that despite the standard of it's a standard of care, and everybody uses and everybody acknowledges the need for the use of this. Insurances are not covering these drugs. And so there is data coming up on that, and one of the problems is the variable clinical practice on this issue. So the ways that we can help with this matter is creating a white paper regarding the antifungal prophylaxis as a standard of care. This was already addressed by the IDCOP, AST publications in 2013, and also in the new IDSA guidelines for aspergillosis. And then we also need to address whether we need a comparative trial that typically cannot be done, and who would be our comparator? I would be using literature pre-itraconazole as a historic control, or how to design something like that. So in summary, the take-homes are that we cannot use a one-size-fits-all approach when designing clinical trials for invasive fungal infections, particularly molds, Aspergillus and other molds, and that we have new problems that we are facing, like the breakthrough infections, the antifungal resistance, and diseases developing in diverse populations, like we discussed Aspergillus in patients that are critically ill with influenza or other respiratory viruses. And the issue of antifungal prophylaxis in lung transplantation that needs to be addressed. Thanks.
While we're getting, GR or Spec is going to do this. Okay, so GR will come up and do the endemics, but I want to ask you all, because I was asking this question today, what is a white paper? We talk about them all the time. And where do they go? I mean, obviously, we mean an opinion piece that's supported with data, and hopefully it ends up in the right hands. FDA's hands, funders' hands, NIH, but these are pieces that'll be published somewhere ultimately. So we just call them generically white papers, but they're really opinion pieces written by people that are passionate about it. Okay, GR.
Great. So thanks so much, Pete, and thanks to those of you who came to the endemic mycosis session. Yes, that's the kind of enthusiasm we need in endemic mycoses, because we are 20 years behind the rest of mycology. I'm going to have drinks with that table when we're done, too. So really the key thing, though, is the endemic mycoses, I think, really represent a tremendous opportunity for evaluation of some of the new antifungal compounds we have coming down the pipe. These are considered orphan diseases, so on discussions with the FDA, really you can get an FDA indication for really a small number of patients in these studies, and then obviously the drug's on the market at that time and a source of revenue, and et cetera. So we do think that these diseases do represent a tremendous opportunity at this time with the number of new drugs coming on the market. The second thing, just for those of you that weren't there, is there's a bill that was going to be before Congress sometime in the next few months for up to $75 million over 5 years towards the study of endemic mycoses. And that will range the full spectrum of disease from basic science, translational work, and clinical trials. So I think that that's really been a long time in coming, but there's really sort of a critical mass that's been reached to try to make big advances in the care of the endemic mycoses. So we'd appreciate advocacy from those of you to call your representative or congressman to really help move this field forward in that way. So the main actionable items, again, just like the other groups, we think a biorepository, particularly for histo, which spans a large region of the country. WashU has a REDCap system that already set up for histo that can be leveraged for other endemics. We have a similar system for cocci-meningitis in California, really with sharing of that data throughout the state. Discussions about big data, John Badley, again, sort of volunteered, or I'm going to volunteer him now, but access to hospital databases to merge different databases, through data abstraction. So some of these, again, are rarer infections with unique risk factors. And again, these new chemotherapeutic agents have placed our patients at sort of an uncertain degree of risk. So assessment of genetic risk, this has been a big question, of course, in the field of coccidioidomycosis, this concern about Filipino and African American patients. Clearly, there's a genetic risk for coccidioidomycosis. Blasto, there's the Hmong population up there really is at increased risk, and it sounds like there's some data coming out soon in that regard. But I think for histo, which seems to disseminate much more rarely, that could really easily be done for pooling tissue samples that are in existing repositories, if there's sort of a shared agreement to do that and to have sequencing of the non-HIV, non-transplant disseminated patients to ascertain their genetic risk for histo. So there was also sort of an informal gentleman's agreement to do a head-to-head comparison of histoplasma diagnostic testing. So I think that will be nice to see. discussion, the last two meetings really have been a sort of discussion about surrogate markers as endpoints in these endemic mycoses. I do think that's a good idea, that we have data for a couple of these, but not for all. Coxie study, we talked about really the ongoing, what's called the FLEET study, to look at treatment of primary pulmonary pneumonia. Does that actually improve their outcomes, or does it just sort of make the physician feel better? That's ongoing. The NIH has really led that effort, and that trial's been run through Duke. And then MSG-15, again, we'd really just like to thank Maine for their support of that. Again, it's really the first endemic trial in the last 20 years with suba-itraconazole to look at a number of these different endemic mycoses. And a number of those sites are set to open just over the next month, and then UAB's already enrolled 2 patients in that study, so that's pretty exciting to actually get clinical evaluation of one of these new compounds already. One of the things we talked about is prophylaxis in high-risk groups. So again, we in California, the firefighters are at tremendous risk for acquisition of coccidioidomycosis. So pretty easy to do sort of a prophylaxis study, which is different than looking at these endemics from the way we're used to. So some of these, if we are able to define what are truly the highest risk groups, how much do they benefit from prophylaxis? And then potential refinement for sort of this pre-transplant or pre-immunosuppression or immunomodulatory agents for histo, either by skin testing or the development of a histofuron assay instead of a quantiferon test. So those were all discussed. So the other thing that was brought up by one of the members is that they wanted to lead the revolution. And so I'll let that person volunteer if they want to divulge themselves. They raised their hand, so Elon Schwartz has volunteered for that. But I do think that this has really been troublesome for a number of reasons. And the crypto group talked about this, and the mold group as well. But this is not free to just change the names of these organisms. It really impacts the diagnostic companies. They have to reevaluate their diagnostics after these organisms are renamed. So it does actually have a financial repercussion rather than just increasing the number of publications for these new species. There's really a lot of confusion. Anytime these organisms are renamed, we're automatically consulted. I'm sure you all deal with that as well. So educational efforts spin out of this as well. The hospital microlab is typically confused for a couple months, as are the hospital staff. And then there's anxiety for some of the house staff as well to look out for differences in the clinical outcomes when they may not exist. So I do think that after hearing this now in 3 groups, this is really a problem. And as John said, bringing sort of numerous critical parties to this would really be key in trying to move this forward and end some of these differences that may not be important. So educational activities, again, a lot of these endemics sort of heal after their primary pneumonia as pulmonary nodules. That's a big problem, particularly if the surgeons aren't aware of that and they're resecting these for fear of lung cancer really without any type of evaluation. There's a couple different sort of clinical algorithms that have been written for coccidioidal nodules within the endemic region, and I know that our histo colleagues certainly struggle with this problem too, as well as blasto. So I think that educational efforts can be directed at some of these groups, I think for the surgeons particularly, but also for rheumatologists, dermatologists, and others that really prescribe a lot of these immunomodulatory medications, trying to inform them about sort of abnormal manifestations of endemic mycoses or other fungal infections really is probably a group we can direct some of our educational efforts towards over the next few years. And then advocacy, there's an issue sort of with how good is our data for epidemiology of these endemic mycoses. There's clearly some issues with the state health departments for data reporting. I think the CDC has been really helpful for this, but we still have a bit of a ways to go to really try to capture all the cases throughout the country to see what our true numbers are. It was also brought up if the state labs could bank isolates if they're not from an endemic region. So sort of an example of that is a couple years ago, there were 3 cases of Coxie in Missouri, which is obviously not in Coxie country. Those patients had not traveled, they didn't have a good history of travel, and they didn't save the isolates. So that kind of sort of assistance from state health departments if they were to bank isolates so they can be looked at to see if they truly are part of the region or not might be useful. Phases of fungal infections, again, this is sort of just patient advocacy, so patients that have had one of these infections that are willing to sort of be the face of the disease as part of an educational initiative for funding efforts, also helpful when we talk to our sort of funding agencies to have those type of advocates. So I'll wrap up there, and thank you all for your attention.
Oh, we got some wild people here in the back. All righty, let's see if we can get my slides back up, and then we'll wrap this up. Okay. please. There we go. I was reminded, I shouldn't have to have been reminded, but you know, this group all started with Bill Dismukes. Hardly a day goes by when I don't think about Bill, and many of you who are of my generation and maybe a little younger remember him. What a gentleman, what a mentor, and what just a classy guy. He was, I mean, if there's a model in academic medicine in terms of just being unselfish, giving of yourself, trying to promote other people's careers, this really is it. And not that we always got along, but literally, not a day goes by when I don't think about him and really consider myself very fortunate to have worked with him and under him. And I'm sure I'll speak for John and others who were in the division. He died last summer. Okay. We're going to have a small meeting of interested people in the morning, those who are brave enough to get up at 6:45, mainly the committee, the program committee, and we'll have our own sort of internal autopsy report. How did the meeting go, et cetera. I'd like to invite industry members to stay just for a few minutes and give us direct feedback. Again, those of us on the program committee willing to stay and hear what you have to say. We found it to be very useful in planning this meeting. The next meeting will be September 2020. It will be the third biennial meeting. You're going to be getting evaluations by email. I think Carolyn, they've already gone out, correct? Right. Be frank. I mean, be very candid. Give us your suggestions. We can't respond to everything, of course. We want to make it the best meeting that it can be. Recognize that this meeting serves a unique purpose. And really by its nature, it probably doesn't lend itself to grow to a point where we have 300 or 400 or 500 people, because it has to be interactive to remain functional, in my opinion. And so it means that we have to continue to get support from industry, because 150 people can't do this on their own routinely. And so we do need industry support, not only to have the meeting, but also to make certain that we have good communications with one another, and that we really are willing to work with one another. So I think at a certain level, we need to remain small. Could we get up to maybe 200? Possibly. But there is a limit to our size, I think, and I think the size of this really does lend itself to good communication between us. What else do I want to say? For those of you who are new to the group, I want you to, I hope you appreciate how unique this group is. This is one of the more collegial, if not the most collegial and interactive of the academic groups you'll work with. We're not cutting one another's throats. I think this really is it's very unique in the world of academic medicine, as best as I can tell. Again, submit your application, your assessments, and I mean this seriously. I'm not just being overly biased, but one of the things that we have to consider as a group is, do we want to have a home for the meeting? And is this the home, or is Asilomar the home where we were 2 years ago, or is it somewhere? Or we can continue to look for a home. Is there an advantage to rotating every 2 years as opposed to working with a known entity? So keep that in mind. And if you hated the place, if you hate the weather or getting here or whatever, say so. If we hear enough of that, then this is, we look elsewhere. Don't forget about Dr. Fungus, and especially, we need your cases. Starting next month, you'll be hearing from me on a regular basis. We're going to change the format a little bit, but we're going to start queuing up the cases. We're going to change their format. I'm basically going to go to Gorga's course and begin to model them a little bit more after their format, and enrich the background a little bit more. GR is going to continue to work on updating the Dr. Fungus website, and we're going to have something that we really can be proud of. And also remember that on our website, all these proceedings of a business nature are going to be on there. Are slides available? Are slides available in PDF on request, or are they just going to be available through seeing the everything? Okay, good. Okay, great. Yep. Okay. Just a couple of things before I get to these. So, I want to thank you all for being here. I really do want to thank you all for being here. This is it's a busy 2 days. I know some would like it to be 3 days. My 17-year-old would not. And those of you who have family, you know what I'm talking about. So it's 2 days. It's been intense, but I think we've gotten a lot done, and I think the fruit of that will show later on. So really, really appreciate your support. Again, as I said from the beginning, truly appreciate the support of industry, because it makes it possible to be in a nice place, and we want to thank you for that. The meeting also could not have happened and run as smoothly as it did without the help of Beth, Barbara, and Debbie, and Ray, who did the entire filming of this session. So they are very professional, did a great job. And finally, Carolyn Thomas, the MSGRC administrator, Elisa Pinehart, our chief person at home, and Rachel McMullen have all been essential to keeping this thing moving. I think they played a critical role in keeping us going. So thanks a lot. I want to congratulate the new officers coming up. You've got a great president in John Badley. You've got a great president-elect in Louis Ostrowski. You've got a great secretary coming up in Condianas, even though he ran unopposed. What did I say? Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me, John Perfect. I'm being aspirational, John. John Perfect, and then Marissa Macelli, not Michelli, as our treasurer. You're in good hands with a great group of new officers. I'm going to be I've been honored to serve for this group for as long as I have. It's really been a passion of mine, and I love doing it. And I'm going to continue to love doing it as your past president, and as chair of the scientific committee. So this is a huge part of my life, and I hope it shows in terms of the fruit that we generate. So thanks for your. Really, truly, thank you for your support. I really appreciate all that you've done. Finally, for those who are going to remain in the area, enjoy all that this area has to offer, but if you hike in groups, if you don't carry bear spray, and bear spray is not to be sprayed on your body. It's sprayed in the eyes. It is not under your arms or around your neck. It's to be sprayed in the eyes of an attacking bear. What the problem is, by that time they're about 5 feet from you, and it might be too late. No, most bear sprays have a range of about 20 feet. But you should not have to use it. Make noise and hike in groups, and don't harass any of the wildlife. And if you're going home, just travel safely. The weather is supposed to be okay tomorrow, so it should be okay. You might want to get an early start going down 191. There has been some construction, but probably not early in the morning. So with that, we'll adjourn, and thank you again. Anything else? Yeah. Okay.